I am Katherine Reynolds Lewis. I'm the founder of the Institute for Independent Journalists and also an independent journalist myself for 15 years based in the Washington, D.C. area, where I write about science, health, kids' behavioral and mental health, race, equity, and a number of other topics. And if you don't know the Institute of Independent Journalists, we are an organization whose mission is the sustainability of independent journalists of color, both financially and emotionally, because that has been just as challenging for me, and I know many of you. And we do believe in a big tent, so we want everyone to come to our events. Everyone is welcome, regardless of identity. We want to build strong networks and share information and get better at doing our work and also serving the editors that we work with so that people get better pitches and there's less wasted time. So I'm really thrilled and grateful to have three busy science and health editors speaking to us today. I want to introduce Lori Leibovich, the editor of the Well section of the New York Times. She's a digital media veteran who's worked at HuffPost, Time Inc., Salon, The Skimm, and many other publications. She lives in Brooklyn with her family. And just to note that when I first invited Lori, she said she had a 1 o'clock hard stop. So she will be just dropping off the webinar. And we're so grateful, Lori, for being with us for the time that you are able to be here. Kyung is a managing editor at WebMD. She leads a team of staff editors and writers and is the lead recruiter for freelancers. She worked for the Seattle Times for 16 years, covering Congress, aerospace, space, and health, not simultaneously. Kyung started her career as a business reporter for the Courier-Journal in Louisville, Kentucky. She was born in Seoul and grew up in Seattle. And last but definitely not least, Shraddha Chakradhar is the deputy news editor for Diversity at Science, shaping coverage of issues at the intersection of science and race, gender and inequity, and helping oversee Science's Diverse Voices internship program. Past roles include serving as deputy editor of Nieman Journalism Lab. I'm a proud columnist for Nieman Reports, so I love that organization, a reporter and internship coordinator at STAT, and an editor and reporter at Nature Medicine. Thank you all so much for being here with us. And we're going to jump right in. I'm going to ask each of you if you could share what you oversee for your media organizations. Just describe the publication or the section that you're in charge of and what you want from independent journalists, whether that's stories, multimedia, or more. And as you're giving that answer, feel free to share how much of your publication uses in-house versus freelance content. And we'll just start with Lori, if that sounds okay.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thank you for putting this together, Katherine. It's great to be with everyone. The New York Times is set up by desks. We have, I don't know how many, but many, many desks. Those include all of our news desks, which, would be national and international business, and so forth. And then I am part of the newsroom that is under the umbrella of culture and lifestyle. That includes 7 desks, which are food, travel, style, books, culture, real estate, cooking, and well. And so the well desk is a primarily service driven section of the New York Times, meaning that we are really trying with our journalism to help readers get answers to their questions about health and wellness, to help guide them in their lives, whether that's about questions they have about relationships or about a COVID shot. That's really our lens, is to be reader first. One point to mention, because it's very confusing even internally, is that we are different than the science desk at the Times, which their remit includes things like covering space, covering international and global health, and they do cover health, but they're looking at it a little bit more through the lens of news. So I always explain that, if a new drug is approved by the FDA, Science is going to cover that news, and Well might do an explainer on things like how, what insurance will cover this drug, who is it for, how much will it cost, things like that. In terms of the number of freelancers that we use on the Well desk, to be honest, and I've shared this with Katherine, it's been We've reduced the number of freelancers we've used quite dramatically in the last 2.5 years, and that has to do with the newsroom investing in the desk. And so my ability to hire a lot of staff reporters has made the need for freelancers less urgent. That said, we still use freelancers, but not as much as we have in the past.
Great. And Kyung, can you share for your publication?
Yes, so I'm a managing editor at WebMD, and we actually have several different desks within the editorial side. We also have a sister subsidiary, Medscape, which is actually aimed at doctors and other healthcare professionals. But WebMD is consumer health and medical news. And I actually am part of a specific team within WebMD that oversees what we call our medical reference content. So we call them MedRef for short. And that is the bread and butter of what you see on our site. If you Google something on infant jaundice or immunotherapy for breast cancer, chances are, and that content was actually created by somebody on our team. And unlike Lori, what Lori just said about the New York Times investing in their staff hires, we're actually currently investing in our freelance resources because I'm actually overseeing a project. It has this fancy name of content consolidation and decannibalization. And that's a fancy way of saying that we're going through our inventory of content on our site that we've created, over the last 25 plus years, and really optimizing it for both readers and for Google search algorithms. And I oversee a team that is made up of maybe a dozen editors, staff editors, but we're actively recruiting freelance editors, and also very actively recruiting freelance writers to create content.
Okay, so it's not that you're banning cannibals from WebMD. You're just
No, not that at all. Not that, but it's very vital work that we're doing right now, and it's a lot of work, and we're always on the hunt. And even without this project, we're always on the hunt for really great talent when it comes to health and medical writing. Because I believe I used to be I started my career as a business reporter, and I used to think that was the hardest thing. But healthcare is right up there, with a lot of different things. And it takes a real unique blend of smarts and writing ability and the ability to follow instructions and just, and when you're a freelancer, the ability to juggle a lot of different balls, pivot, from one client, one outlet to the next. So I have a lot of respect for people who make their living as freelancers.
Thank you. We love to hear that. And just as a reminder, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, not in the chat. That chat is busy, so I'm going to miss questions in there. I also just want to mention, please do sign up for our future webinars at the IIJ.com. I was going to just put it in the chat, but I can see it's going to be buried. So Shraddha, can you share a little bit about what you're looking for at Science?
Yes, first of all, thank you so much for having me and for organizing this. And hello, everybody. It's so great to see so many Massachusetts people in the chat. I'm based in the Boston area, so welcome everyone. So a little bit more about Science. So we are a very research focused publication. Science, as you know, is a research journal. We have a news section, which is independent of the research pages of the journal, but given our audience, what that means is all our news stories need to have a research bend. I like to think of it as if a scientist or a group of scientists, researchers, investigators, even policymakers are doing something, researching, studying, investigating, like those sort of like actions, that's kind of a story that would be perfect for us. So we don't tend to do a lot of doctor's office kind of stories. We don't tend to do consumer health kind of stories. We don't tend to do medical device kind of stories unless there's a clinical trial, some sort of investigation, some things, that's happening on the research side of things. But we cover all avenues of science, everything from biomedicine and the physical sciences to archaeology, anthropology, social sciences. As Katherine mentioned at the top, my title is Deputy News Editor of Diversity, so also culture of science issues. And so in that sense, we're pretty broad. The research focus is pretty narrow, but which part of science that research focus applies to is fairly broad. We do have a pretty robust staff, and a lot of our stories are written by staff members, but a lot of our stories are written by freelancers. We have a very active online news section where a lot of your bread and butter like study stories are posted, and so that section is often written by freelancers, and we're regularly looking for freelancers to help us fill those pages, so to speak. So definitely pitch us. And then, as deputy news editor, I will say that my personal mission is to help diversify our bylines. Science is a legacy publication. We are part of AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, which was an organization that was set up by Thomas Edison. And so as a legacy publication, you can imagine, where historically we haven't been a very diverse staff. We continue to not be that diverse, but we're really making a push to change that. We want to hear from people who have different perspectives than our staff historically has. Pitch us those stories that we may have missed. And so that's sort of my MO at Science as well.
Thank you so much, Shraddha. And I just want to also reassure everyone, I have done these webinars before. I will ask all the questions on your minds. Don't worry. So I'll just start by getting to the first one, which is for Shraddha and Lori. What's an ideal pitch for your publication? What really gets your attention? And can you talk about the range of story lengths or types of projects that you would prefer, as well as what is the best way to get in touch? Either share an email address in the chat, or let us know if there's a form you have, or how folks who want to pitch you and are clearly eager to do that this afternoon can get in touch. So Lori, why don't you start?
So generally speaking, I'm looking, the pitches that are most interesting to me are generally in beats that we don't already cover with a staff reporter. So I can put some of the beats in the chat afterwards, but for example, we have a mental health reporter, we have a reporter who covers relationships, we have someone covering COVID, we have someone covering brain health. And so I'm really looking for the most part for pitches that are on the outside of that, in areas that we don't have a reporter already assigned to. A lot of some of the freelancers that we work with have started off doing kind of what I would call Wells bread and butter, which is service-oriented stories. So just an example from this week, we published a story by a freelancer who had pitched us on sort of a concept in psychology called mattering, which is what it sort of speaks for itself, but it's about the connection between happiness and fulfillment and mattering, and that having people in your life that are showing you how much you mean to them is really a strong indicator of happiness and well-being at work and in personal lives. So it kind of touched on mental health, but really it was like a concept that we had not heard about. The freelance writer had talked to the person who sort of has identified this and made it his field of study. So she had already told me in her pitch that she had spoken to him and done a long interview and could do more. I didn't work with her directly, but with the editor, there was some back and forth about finding examples of people who had, felt matter, felt like they, who exemplified this concept. And it was just a really nice example of, something the editors on the desk had not heard about before. So I think that novelty factor is also really, really key sometimes with a freelance piece. And again, touching on areas of study or topics that we don't generally cover was also really helpful. We do have an email address for pitches. I'll put that in the chat as well.
Great. And Shraddha, what about you? What is your ideal pitch, or what would really get your attention?
Yeah, sort of echoing what Lori said, and because we do have a staff, and each reporter has their beat, we're really looking for something that we may have missed. That being said, if it's a well-written pitch, we often hand out assignments. If it's a well-written pitch, you'll be on our radar. And when there's a story that we're looking to assign to somebody, because, often our staff is swamped and there's a story we want to do, but no one who would typically do it on staff is available, then we might come back to you. So for us, a well-written pitch, which, explains right away what the novelty factor is, the timeliness, like why we should worry about covering this now, give an indication that you do have access to sources by either having talked to somebody or indicating that you've made contact with somebody. Don't say in your pitch, oh, I would like to talk to so-and-so, because then we don't know whether you're actually going to make that connection or not. Editors are very risk averse. And so, we want to know, especially when working with a new writer, that the investment we're about to make is going to give us some return. And so the other thing that's kind of a turnoff for us is if you have questions in your pitch, but no indication whether you have answers. And so because we're like, well, tell us, like, a lot of pitches that we see will have like a long list of like, this story is going to look at whether this happens or this happens. And we'll be like, well, does it happen? Because if we say go ahead and the answer is actually no, it doesn't happen, then what's the point? Yeah, and my particular beat that I help oversee, diversity in science, culture of science issues, that's an area that we're particularly looking for pitches on. We have an in-house diversity reporter, but he's one person and can only do so many stories. And I'm about to drop in the chat our freelancer guidelines, which are pretty exhaustive. It includes, what to include in the email, which people to pitch for what stories, our pay rates. It's pretty exhaustive. My email, I'm also on that page, so my email is in there. If there's not a question that's answered by that, do email me after the webinar. I'm happy to try and get you an answer.
Okay, thank you. And Kyung, since you don't take pitches, what gets your attention when you're looking at a new contributor's bio, resume, or introductory letter? What are you looking for in terms of their qualifications or clips?
So I have learned over the years that really, for me personally, the most, I think, helpful tool for me to gauge that potential freelancers' ability and talent and potentially is really their clips. And I know that sometimes it's hard to tell how much of that work is that person's work product. Maybe they wrote for the New York Times and it was heavily edited perhaps, so it's hard to tell. But I think you can see a body of work and kind of get a real clear sense of that person's capabilities. So that's what I personally look for. I want to see if you're reaching out to me because you're interested in working with WebMD. I'm going to, obviously look at your background and your experience and all that, but I really want to see some, just terrific clips. And specifically because we create these reference articles, so they're supposed to be comprehensive, authoritative, but written in a way that in the voice of somebody like, you know, the best friend, you know, who went on that doctor's appointment with you while you couldn't really concentrate or focus, and just understood everything that the doctors were saying and say, okay, listen, this is what you have, this is what you should do, you know. So that's really one of the hardest things I think to do in journalism, is to be able to be essentially bilingual. Like, you have to understand these very clinical, you know, research that you have to go through, but then take that hat off and then just write at literally at an 8th grade level, you know. And I tell our freelancers, we're aiming for like the middle school kid, you know, and not even like the smartest middle school kids. We want the average middle school kid that they can understand these articles. So a very vivid example we use is, we don't use words like urinate. Maybe Science Magazine does that, but we say, you know, if appropriate, we say pee, you know. And I think that really kind of tells people the level of medical literacy that we're aiming for.
I love it. That's very visceral. So would you want someone to just send a letter of introduction with their clips? And where would they send that, Kyung?
Well, for my team, you can send that to me directly, and I'll share my email. So I would quickly say about our freelance recruitment efforts, because used to be, you know, even maybe 2 years ago, our team was probably 75% editors and 25% staff writers. Now it has shifted to almost 100% staff editors, and we're relying almost exclusively on freelance writers, as well as additional freelance editing help. And so I'm constantly recruiting and onboarding freelancers, and there are so many really amazingly talented people out there. But editors are risk averse, and they really like to go back to the rock stars that they work with, you know, constantly. And it can be challenging for a new writer to break through that. So I would say my batting average is, for maybe out of every 10 people that I think really could make it as a freelancer for WebMD, I would say maybe 2 out of those 10 people eventually become a regular contributor to our company. And that's largely because they just never got a, you know, chance at bat, you know. And I think the way you break through that is just very polite persistence. I never mind somebody repeatedly reaching out to me. Well, I wouldn't say never, but mostly I don't, because I really do think that sometimes it's just a matter of just timing or luck that somebody makes that connection, and you think, oh, I have an assignment, this person could do it, you know, because there are a lot of names in our spreadsheet and people's memories are faulty, and, you know, so just get on the radar as often as you can.
I love it. That's so encouraging. I once had an editor tell me I walked that fine line between, you know, pleasantly persistent and stalker. So
it is a very fine line, right? So you don't want to majorly annoy people, but we understand. I mean, we make a lot of we're very tolerant of freelancers, because we rely on them, first of all, but we know that it's tough. And we really would like to give people a chance to prove, you know, their talents.
wonderful. And the next question that I know everyone's waiting for is, can you talk specifically about your pay rates or range of rates? You know, if it's per word, what are your typical word lengths? And do you pay on submission of the piece, acceptance of the piece, or publication of the piece? So I'll start with Shraddha, if that's okay.
Yes, this is also on our freelancer guideline page, but generally for online stories, our starting rate is 75 cents a word. But it depends on experience, but no one's going to get less than 75 cents per word. But people very quickly move up to $1 a word if your work was something that we liked and you are a repeat contributor to us. For our print, magazine, because we have an online section, and then very select stories go into print. That starts at $1.25 per word, but again, depending on experience, but that's the minimum. So that's those are our rates.
Okay, great. And Lori?
Yeah, apologies in advance because there is such a huge storm happening outside. You may hear rain through my microphone because I'm right by the window. Anyway, our rates are generally $1 a word up to 1,500 words for pieces, and we pay at the per word rate is based on the published word count, which is usually not wildly different than the assigned word count. But I just like to make that clear. And, you know, if we were to engage with someone on like a longer, you know, we haven't done this in a long time, to be honest, but like on a longer guide or a sort of more intensive project, we sometimes then revert to a project rate because it's a different kind of story.
Great. And Kyung?
I forgot to add, Lori, your response reminded me. We pay we generally pay upon publishing, but we're flexible about that. Different editors have different policies. We're trying to streamline that. We understand that some freelancers have the flexibility to wait until publishing, others don't. The only reason we wait until publishing is so that we can pay based on what the final word count is, but we understand that the story might change. So if we pay whichever is longer, commissioned or published, whatever is longer, we'll just pay that. So sorry to interrupt.
I'll just add too, you reminded me that that's also our reasoning for paying upon publication is that we then know what the final word count is. But if there's a situation where, you know, the piece has been edited and is ready to go and we need to hold it for some reason because we had another piece on a similar topic, then we pay, you know, before publication, but it's kind of case by case.
Great. And Kyung, what about your pay rates? When do you pay? And also if you can include your editor pay rates for that?
Yes, I saw that in the question. So WebMD, at least my team, we pay fixed rates for our assignments, and we have a slew of different assets, as we call them, that we commission. So there can be medical reference articles, there can be features, slideshows, quizzes. I mean, they're just, you know, a long form narrative. And so we don't pay by the word. There's a fixed fee, and our the medical reference articles, bread and butter reference content, is $500, and the features and slideshows $750. A long form narrative can be, you know, it's $2,000. Longer features, I think, can go up to $1,200, and if they want you to do like an infographic on top of that, maybe that's another $250. The question about rate for editing. So we're currently in this multi-year project for which we are enhancing our existing articles. And for that, we are paying a flat $50 an hour rate for editors, as well as the writers that we are reaching out to. And as far as how quickly we pay, since we don't pay by the word, we pay as quickly as we're able to. I mean, typically, by the time you submit an invoice, I think you would see your payment within a week or two. I mean, paying freelancers is one of my small joys, so we try to be really quick at paying. And I think that's something that freelancers have mentioned to us, that they really appreciate our speedy invoice processing. So.
I love the little hearts coming up, and it's also one of my joys to send invoices, Kyung. I know freelancers dread it, but I just always have this mental image of like gold flowing through my hands when I invoice my publications. So I'm going to turn to a little bit more complicated issue, which is contract terms. And it's something we talk a lot about at the IIJ. If you're new here, welcome to the contract discussion. There's 3 issues that freelancers really care about when it comes to contracts, those who've been around the block. What are the copyright license terms? Or is it a work for hire contract? Number 2, What derivatives rights does the freelancer retain? And as someone who wrote a book based on the most read article Mother Jones has ever published, I really am glad I had derivative rights to that article. And number 3, is the freelancer being asked to indemnify the publication from lawsuits? So I'll ask Shraddha to start if you have those answers, and if you need a second, I can go to someone else first.
Sorry, I was just answering a question in the Q&A. So I asked, and this is all the information that I have. So we pay for exclusive first publication. Ours is not a work for hire. So we pay for exclusive first publication rights for online stories after 2 weeks. Writers are free to do what they want. For print stories, it's a month, just given the nature of the kinds of stories that go online versus the ones that go in our magazine. We do have an indemnification clause promising to protect freelancers and defend them unless, you know, there's obvious like wrongdoing on their part. And yeah, sorry, what was the other part of your question?
And then derivative rights, I guess that's answered by the first one. If the rights were after 2 weeks.
Yeah, 2 weeks for online and 4 weeks or a month for print. So
Kyung, can you answer those 3 terms?
So I can only remember 2 because I also was answering the chat. So WebMD, our indemnification clause will hold you harmless. So we protect the freelancers. And what was the second one? I've already forgotten that.
I'm guessing it's either a work for hire or you need exclusive rights.
Yes, it is a work for hire, and we would own the product that you deliver for us.
Great. And I did take a peek at the New York Times contract before this, so I'm happy to share that although it is a work for hire contract, which we don't typically love at the IIJ, the contributor will receive 50% of any syndication fees that the Times gets from individual syndication, like not a collective work or something, which I have signed work for hire contracts myself because I know sometimes you just need to syndicate. And it can make sense in some cases. And the Times does not require freelancers to indemnify the institution. It's just silent, which is also a positive from the IIJ's perspective. I'm gonna jump in. You know, I really appreciate, we didn't prepare this question, but I really appreciate what Shraddha said about, like, you know, what you need to see in a pitch, the sort of why now, why us, like what is the urgency about it. So I wonder if we could have, and then also Kyung saying, you know, you need to really reduce risk. I'm curious if, as the 3 of you look at pitches or look at resumes, are there sort of other publications that when you see a clip from that place, you're like, oh, okay, I trust that this person knows their stuff, that maybe isn't at the level where you are, but you're like, I trust that this, clip is going to probably deliver me one of those 2 out of 10 reliable freelancers that Kyung mentioned. It sometimes helps, I think, when we look at, I really want a byline in Science or the New York Times or WebMD, what are the other publications in that universe that the 3 of you respect and appreciate and would trust sort of someone coming from an experience there? And whoever would like to jump in first would be great.
Sure. Because we're a research journal, there are other research journals like ours that also have news sections. So Nature Medicine, Nature Biotechnology, basically any other place, the New York Times Science Desk, what else, Stat, basically any other publication that publishes news stories grounded in scientific research. So it could be newspapers, it could be, all your scientific magazines. So we have lots of competitors. So lots of opportunities for you all to write elsewhere and prove to us why you could also write for us.
For me, it's funny, I often get pitches from people who have written for other sections of the Times. So Science section being first and foremost, and usually, and then sometimes even sections like styles or cooking, if the person is a food-oriented writer or something like that. So that's really, really helpful. That means that they've already gone through the process of, the Times editing, which for those of you who have written for us know that there are 2 editors on every story. So, that's sometimes people who are brand new to the Times are confused or not prepared for the fact that they're going to have one first editor who's doing the majority of the editing with you, but then it goes to a second editor who often has other questions too. So other Times sections are ones I look for more features. I would say places like The Atlantic, Wired, Outside, particularly if someone is pitching me something on fitness or physical health. Outside has a really long tradition of doing great work on that area, in that area. So yeah, those are some of the places I look for.
Great, thank you. Kyung?
So since we work with such a wide variety of freelance writers, I tend not to look at really where their work was published. I really try to home in on the work that they have produced and really look for signs of quality. And what I'm looking for is the analytical mind, somebody who can actually synthesize information, really just parachute into a topic, because WebMD, we cover everything under the sun. So you're never going to be the person who always gets the assignments of rheumatology or cancer. You will get a bunch of different assignments. So we were looking for that utility player. And I think the common thread that we look for is people who are able to just dive in and get really familiar with that topic and then start writing as if they are in fact, the expert for that day, for that topic. There's a question in the chat about, what if you don't have health clips or medical clips, but you have some maybe business or financial clips? I started as a business reporter. I covered Boeing and Kentucky Fried Chicken. I covered a lot of different things. So I know that there is a common thread. If you can do one beat really well, probably you're going to be able to do something else really well. But I would actually caution that, if you're thinking about sort of dipping, your toe into health writing that you currently don't do, then I would say be really sure that this is a topic that you're interested in, because I think you really have to be really excited about the whole field of consumer health and medical news to really excel at it, because it is not easy.
Thank you so much, Kyung. You actually reminded me of another question we had talked about in our prep, was if folks want to share in the chat, who do write about health, we're kind of curious what else you write about. That was something that came up. And I'll just say, it's funny, your background is business, so is mine. And I write often for the Washington Post well section, well plus being section. And I know the editors there have a business background, and they feel like there's some parallels between the analytical mind of a business journalist and the critical and fact-checky and analytical mind of a healthcare science journalist. So.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I'm going to also ask the question that freelancers get so worried about is you feel like you're pitching into a black hole, you're not getting any responses, you're wondering if you have a digit wrong in the email address. What should a freelancer do to get your attention that's not creepy? And do you have any tips on what not to do if you're really trying to get into a particular publication?
I would say there's really not, there's not like a bells and whistles or something that you absolutely need to include in the subject line or anything like that. We really do read every single pitch. It just, sometimes our timeline is obviously doesn't work with yours. And, we have someone on our desk who monitors that email that is, looking at it every day. So it should never be a concern that no one has seen it or, that it's disappeared into a black hole. I will say that we did have, if something was sent to us, there was like a period of 6 months earlier this year where we had this crushing email like snafu that we didn't know about. And so when we finally got it resolved, we had 1,500 pitches. So if you were one of those people who pitched us between roughly like March and August, I am so sorry. I don't know, honestly, if we're going to be able to go through all of them, but we have resolved that issue and someone is looking at it every day. And I would say that I think you may be getting to this later, Katherine, sorry to scoop you, but I would say that following up before a week is not great, just because there's a really good chance we haven't had a chance to look at it yet. And the exception to that, of course, is like if you're writing to tell us that, you know, another publication has accepted the pitch and you want to yank it, or just keeping us informed about what's happening, or if there's some urgency, if there's a news peg that's going to pass if we don't get back to you, obviously that's okay. But you know, sometimes people who haven't heard back, who have pitched the general pitch box and haven't heard back in a day or two, will then email me directly or one of my editors, and that's really hard. So.
Yeah, similar things. All the editors, we have a general email, it's like, again, on that freelancer guideline page, a general email where if you're not sure who specifically to pitch to, like oftentimes freelancers will, sorry about that, will send a pitch there. And all editors get access to that. So somebody usually responds within like a day or two, because we'll quickly, you know, we'll take the freelancer off that email chain, we'll quickly talk about it. You know, but what to include to get our attention, include pitch in the subject line so we know exactly what it is, versus like just an unsolicited random email. You know, a lot of the stuff is probably things many of you have heard about, but you know, explain what the news is, pretty much at the top, why it's important, why now, why us. And I would say often the biggest thing that's missing from pitches is a sense that you have spent some time looking through our site to see if and how we have covered that topic before, because so often we're writing back to freelancers being like, oh, we covered this last week, or we covered this last month, or like one of our reporters covered it 2 years ago. What's new? Because even if we've covered it, if you can give us a sense of that, what's new, we might still cover it, you know, and it's, it just, you know, it's a pretty quick turn off if you haven't done that little bit of homework. Obviously all the other like general rules apply, like make sure it's good writing, especially if we haven't worked with you before. Like a pitch is often that first test of like what kind of copy we might expect from you. So, you know, a typo or two is fine, but like if it's really hard to read, then that's kind of a red flag. So yeah, that's basically it. And if it's very time sensitive, meaning you're pitching a story about an embargoed study, or like, I don't know, there's like a hearing about some, I don't know, like EPA rule, and then you think that the story needs to go up before that ruling is made, then, you know, indicate that in the subject, or say very clearly that, you know, this is what's happening and why you need a response sooner, then we may be able to get back to you. And then also definitely tell us if you plan to shop around, send that pitch to multiple places, or just say, you know, I'm hoping to send this to a different outlet in like 2 days or 3 days or whatever it is. So we're not blindsided.
Great. And Kyung, can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, since we don't work with pitches, we make assignments, and very prescriptive assignments, I should say. But the parallel to it, parallel to sort of like following up on a pitch for us is that we might have recruited a freelance writer and actually had them sign a contract or an agreement and onboarded them, and then they don't get an assignment. And this happens quite often. And I always say, feel free to reach out and say, hey, it's been 6 months and I haven't got my first assignment, or it's been 3 months since I last wrote for you. I'm available. And even our regular, contributors sometimes will have periods when they're not busy. They have the bandwidth, and some of those people will actually reach out. The ones who've been writing for us for 10, 20 years will say, hey, next month I have this window. Do you have anything? And that's a really good prompt for an editor to think about assigning to that person, because we have probably about a dozen assigning editors on our specific team, and a couple of spreadsheets of all the potential freelance writers who can write for us. But it's such a number that editors just keep going to their, all-star cast over and over. And so if you can find that opening and say, hey, it's been a while, I'm available. Or even better, you can say, remember, I really have a lot of experience covering cardiology or mental health or something. That sometimes can be a little trigger for us and say, hey, I've got something. So just try different ways. And I say never make apologies for being pushy. I mean, that's how you make a career, right?
I love it. That's good journalism, right? To be a little pushy. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick lightning round, and then I'm going to turn to the Q&A because I know you all have been very patient. And for this, I'm going to ask a question, and folks either raise a thumb for yes, put it down for no, or if you want to share like a couple words or a sentence, that's fine too, but hopefully they'll be pretty quick. So we've touched on this a bit, but how do you all feel? Are simultaneous submissions okay for your publication if disclosed? I think Shraddha said yes. And then is it okay to send multiple story ideas in the same email, or just one for, I guess, Shraddha and Lori? Multiple is okay for Lori?
I would say it depends on how much is multiple. Don't send like 10. Like
Agreed.
3 is okay. But yeah, like there's a saturation point, I guess.
And then if a story doesn't work out, do you have a kill fee?
Yeah, our kill fee is 1/3 of the commissioned rate. Unless it was like so far along in the process and like something has to change, but generally it's 1/3 of the commission fee.
Our kill fee.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, our kill fee is 25% of the rate. But in my 6 years at WebMD, I think I paid out 2 kill fees. So it's very rare.
We have a kill fee, and I need to check what it is now because it's changed. So I'll put that in the chat.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask you each to also smile because I forgot to get a photo, and we're going to send just do a quick screenshot. So I wanted to, I think those are the main, I know Kyung had said you do have slideshows and other types of format. What types of multimedia or audio pitches or other non sort of text projects do you take from freelancers?
So WebMD, we have an in-house video team as well, so and a podcast crew. So our side is really strictly words, and we have our photo department, so it's just really words.
Same for us. We have a huge audio division and video, and so we're just working with freelancers with words.
Yeah, we similar. I know the most about text submissions. We do work with freelance photographers who will often be paired with like a freelance contributor for a story. We have a pretty busy international desk, for example, and so we don't really have like in-house photographers. And so, if there's like a freelance story that's taking place and that's set in like Brazil, for example. Like we'll work with like freelance photographers, but occasionally we get pitches, but that's handled by our multimedia team. And so if anybody is particularly curious about that, email me and I can connect you with them. But we don't really actively take multimedia pitches.
Okay, great. So we have some questions from the audience. The first one is for Lori. When you're thinking about, is this a story for Well or another desk? And this question in particular is about the disability desk. How do you know if it's a better fit for you or a better fit for them?
I think again, it's is there like a consumer health and a service lens that the piece has? We do, we do cover news, we do news stories, we do feature stories, we do enterprise stories, but even those generally have some takeaways for the reader. And so I would say, think about it in terms of that, but also, I'm in a lot of contact all the time with the other desk heads and people around the newsroom. So if you send it to me and it isn't right for me, I can also either tell you who might be a better fit or send it to them directly.
And actually, Lori, I have another question for you that just came in. Well, first of all, if the New York Times is investing in staff and you're expanding, are you open to hiring freelancers who might want something more permanent? And could you again share who you already have, like what beats you already have covered?
Sure. I don't have it in front of me, so I'm certain I'm gonna miss some things. We have a mental health reporter, a relationships, parenting, and sex and dating reporter. We have a viruses and health conditions reporter. We have someone doing news and general assignment who also focuses on things like cannabis and alcohol and Ozempic and the other weight loss drugs. We have someone covering women's health and health inequities. We have someone covering brain health, dementia, and longevity. I'm missing people. I have someone covering fitness and sports. And and nutrition. We have a nutrition reporter. So those are the beats that we have covered in-house. The question about freelancers moving into permanent roles, there are a handful of freelancers who write regularly for us, who we've worked with for a long time. When we have open roles, obviously they're welcome to apply. I don't think that's happened at least since I've been there, mostly because I think the freelancers that we work with regularly are wanting to stay freelance. They like the flexibility, and many of them don't live in New York, where most of our reporters are based. So it's not like that couldn't happen, but I don't think it's happened yet.
Great. There's also a question about, do you require that an interview is actually done before you accept the pitch, or is it okay to just mention who you might want to interview?
I guess I would say it depends on the story. Like obviously if it's a profile that you're pitching, you need to have talked to your subject at least a little bit to get a sense of what the profile is really going to focus on, what the angle is going to be. If you're pitching like a simpler, I don't want to say that they're a simple study story, for example, like we can assume that you're going to talk to the authors, you're going to find an outside expert or two to talk to. You don't necessarily have to have done that interview yet. So it kind of depends on the story, but we want to see at least that you've thought about the sources you will need to contact, you have attempted to contact. So more than having done a lot of reporting, we want to often see the reporting plan, if you will, so that there are not surprises down the road, or if there are potential pitfalls, we can sort of identify it early in the process.
Ditto, 100%. Obviously, a profile subject needs to have been contacted or, been willing to talk. But, most cases, a list of the kinds of people that you are ready to go out to, who won't be, maybe particularly hard to get on, on the record, is plenty.
And I'm going to ask Lori one more question that I'm going to ask all three and then say goodbye because I know you have to go. Can you talk about the steps in your editorial process? So what is, obviously things change, like some stories take longer or less, but ideally, how quickly do you respond to pitches, from pitch to deadline to publication? What is the timeline, and how many rounds of edits or individuals are involved in that process?
So, depending on what kind of story it is, if it's what we call an evergreen story, I would say that generally speaking, once we accept a pitch, the deadline is usually about a month. But if it's seasonal or if there's some news element, obviously it would be quicker than that. As I was mentioning earlier, the Times has a 2-editor process for every story. What that means is that the first editor is really working with you on structure, sourcing, the lead, like making sure that everything is very much in place and has been edited, and your first editor has gone back and forth. It's really hard to say how long that takes. It really depends on the story and the writer. And then after that, it goes to second edit. And second editing is a fact-checking layer, it's a copy editing layer, and it's also sort of a gut check layer. So if you're reading a story as a second editor at the Times, you're also really putting on your reader hat, and you're saying, is that concept clear? Are readers going to know this word or this idea, or do we need to give a few more lines to explain it? Is everything clear? Are there clear takeaways? And they're like the polisher / last kind of word. I wish I could say I read everything that goes up before it goes up, and that's just not possible now that we've grown so much. There's just too much copy coming through every week. But if it's a complicated story, if it's a controversial story, if it's something that we've invested a lot in terms of time, money, and resources, then myself or my deputy will also do a round of editing, or at least reading. Usually it's between the first and the second edit. And so we try to send the writer back comments that come from us, when we also send back any comments from the second editor, so you don't have whiplash and you're not like responding, doing all these rounds. So we try to consolidate it.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here, Lori. You were so great.
Thank you for having me. And what a great group, and so many people. So thank you so much.
Kyung, do you want to talk about, from your perspective, what's the editorial timeline, or how quickly do you turn around a project, and how many folks are involved?
So our editorial process is actually quite streamlined. And so if you were to write a medical reference article for us, typically the assigning editor, I don't make assignments directly myself, but the assigning editor probably will give you no less than, say, 3 days, a week, 10 days, depending, because we're not publishing daily. So we have a lot more flexibility in terms of deadline. And every article that comes in is edited by one editor, and then it goes to a doctor, a medical reviewer. And it can be our in-house doctors, but the vast majority are reviewed by freelance specialists. And then they come back, and if there are any issues or reconciliation, the editors handle that, and then it goes to copy desk. There's very little back and forth between the writer and the editor, as long as the assignment pretty much hits the mark. Again, because we issue very detailed and prescriptive assignment letters down to the level of, here's the headline, here are the keywords, here are the sections we want you to cover, here are the sections we don't need you to cover, because we have probably 50 other articles on that. So as long as you're able to just stay within those guardrails and really deliver what we're looking for, you're pretty good, and then we pay you. The freelance editors, ironically, also get an editor, at least initially, because we do second eye edits to make sure that the editors are truly able to, are able to actually finesse that entire article. And when I was a reporter, I used to think that being a reporter and a writer was much harder than being an editor. And I still think that. I mean, reporting and writing is actually a harder job. But an editor is really where I feel like an editor is really the buck stops, at least at WebMD. So you really want to make sure that, especially with newer people that you work with, that you do second eye edits, and it can take weeks for them to finally be approved to go without those training wheels. So.
Wonderful. Shraddha, what about you?
Yeah, our editorial process varies slightly for online and print stories. For the first part of it, which is getting the story ready, is the same for both, which is that you and your editor will decide the scope of the story. You'll have your assignment, or once the pitch is accepted, you'll decide what exactly is going to happen. For online stories, the turnaround tends to be pretty quick, like for online only stories, I mean. So because it's usually like a study story with an embargo, or it's pegged to some other like timely event, or passage of legislation or something like that. And so what you and your primary editor will go back and forth, getting it into pretty good shape, and sort of like the process that Lori was describing, it goes to a top editor for sort of like a checks and balances. There's not fact checking that's done at that stage, but a top editor is looking for, how easily it reads, any like sensitivity issues. For example, I'm a new mom, and this week there was a study that came out about how kangaroo moms form like neighborhood watch type clubs to like look at for their joeys. And so the primary editor wanted me to like take a look at the story just to make sure there weren't like any like sensitive like cliches or stereotypes about like moms and like bake sales or whatever in the copy of the story. So so a top edit could be a lot of those things, just to clean up any missed clunkiness, jargon, sensitivity, all of that. So then once the top editor has read it with comments, it goes back to the primary editor and the writer, and then you basically clean it up and get it ready for the copy editors. Our copy editors do some fact checking. We still expect the onus of and the majority of the fact checking to be done by the reporter. We don't have a dedicated fact checking team, but the copy editors, because they're checking for style and all of that, sometimes would be like, oh, you have this particular source at X university, but we actually found that they were at Y university. Like, can you double check? So some fact checking gets done in that process as well. And at that point, if it's an online story, it goes up. For a print story, Monday and Tuesday of the week, we are a weekly print magazine, and it comes out every Friday, but the issue goes live online on Thursday afternoon. But Monday and Tuesday is when the pages are laid out, everything is done, and Tuesday is like the absolute final day for our print stories to go to the printer. So the week sort of like ramps up leading up to like the Monday and Tuesday. It's like organized chaos those 2 days. And then like Wednesday is our like chill day as we gear up for the next cycle. So if you have a story in print, then your editor might ask you to file, say, like Thursday of a week, so that it can go through the editing process like Friday. and maybe even top editing done by Friday, so that Monday it can just go to like layout and copy, because we're really like doing final checks on like late Monday and Tuesday. And that's something your editor will communicate with you. So at that point, what that means is that they'll be sending you PDFs of the layout for you to like give it another close read, and go through that little extra check. For both types of for both print and online, fairly early in the process, we ask our writers to file an art memo, basically, looping in our photo team to be like, hey, I'm writing this story. It has an embargo, if it has an embargo, what it is, and then just give like a gist of the story, and then just propose some ideas, like what are the main things, like if it's this kangaroo story that I mentioned, be like, oh, just like, I don't know if you can find like a group of kangaroos, I don't know what they call a pod, I don't know, but a group of kangaroos, it would be good if we could also see some like joeys and pouches. That's it, just an idea, and then the photo team will sort of do their thing. If it's like a larger feature story, that conversation also happens fairly early on, because feature stories, multiple photos, sometimes there's illustration, sometimes maybe there's a graphic, whatever. So but that's generally our editorial process, and an editor will keep you sort of posted on like what's next, and the more you do it for us, the more you'll know what it is.
Love that story. I want to read that story about the kangaroos. And so does that mean that Wednesday is the best day to pitch because you're not inundated?
Yes, definitely don't pitch on Monday. Tuesday afternoon is okay because the dust is starting to settle. But yeah, Wednesdays are great. Thursdays are also good, especially if it's a timely story, because that's when we're like, oh, what are we going to put in the next issue? So if there's a great story, a story that's good for print is one that has compelling art possibilities, something that's going to be timely but also evergreen. I know that's confusing, but as I mentioned, the print issue comes out every Friday. The online version goes up late Thursday afternoon. So we don't want a study story whose embargo lifted on like the previous Saturday, because by the time the next Thursday rolls around, like it's not going to be timely anymore. So it needs to have a certain sense of agency or urgency, but like also stand that like small test of time to make it at least from when we wrap up the issue on Monday afternoon, Tuesday, until 2.5 days later. Yeah, like policy stories that have strong takeaways, again, like study stories don't tend to go in the print issue unless it's like kind of an earth-shattering study that's like really testing our previous understanding of something huge. It tends to be more like policy stories that have like big takeaways for policy, perhaps, and then stories that have like compelling art, because when you're thumbing through a magazine, you want to see some pretty pictures. So
Thus kangaroos. I get it. It makes sense. A question I skipped earlier, I'm going to come back to, because Lori did give an example of a freelance pitch that worked well for them. And I would love to hear from the two of you. There was also a question in the Q&A about examples of stories that either, like Kyung, the kinds of assignments that you might give out to a freelancer, or Shraddha, I think you answered a question about that. I'm going to put the links that you put into the chat. But if either of you could share, maybe a newer person who just started writing for you, or a freelance pitch that you got, Shraddha, why, and talk about why it really worked well, or what gave you that confidence that it would work for your audience.
Yeah, so let's see. Many of you have probably found this, but it's hard I don't have many examples, if any, of a freelancer sort of hitting the mark on the first try, because it's a new relationship. You're like trying to like figure it out. But what has happened more often is we get a pitch, we like the quality of the pitch, the story may not be right for us because like maybe we have a story already in the works that's very similar to that, or it's for whatever reasons it doesn't work for us, but we like the quality of the writing, and so we'll invite the writer to pitch us again, or we'll work with the writer to refine the pitch. We like the clips that the writer has from some other place, and therefore we're like, this is the kind of writer that we'd like to see published in our own pages. So one example of that, which happens more frequently than like a pitch just being accepted right out of the gate, is we knew we wanted a story on how AI is playing out in the global South. That is a giant topic, right? Topic, not story. And we knew we had a freelancer pitch us some like AI research stories, but that weren't quite right. We also knew we had like a special issue all on AI coming out in July of this year. That special issue came out a couple months ago. And so we went back to this freelancer and we were like, hey, we know you've written about AI a lot. We have the special issue coming up. One story we would like to see in there is something about AI in the global South. Can you do a little digging and pitch us something that works under that very broad umbrella? And this freelancer did. He dug into it a little bit and he came back with a couple of story possibilities, and we worked with him to narrow it down to just one story, and that ended up being a feature in our AI issue in July. And so that we are very open to working with freelancers to refine a pitch, to basically hit the nail on the head. It does not, it's very rare that, like I said, it's very rare that it happens that a freelancer just knows exactly what we want. And we know it's a very high bar to cross. So I guess I would iterate, really put work into the pitch, because even if that particular story isn't what we end up publishing, it could have these positive, I think, like downstream effects.
Is that the story, AI often mangles African languages?
Yes. Yep. That's it.
And Kyung, we are at our time, but if you all have a minute or two to stay on, I would love just to ask a general question of anything else that you wanted to share to a group of freelancers. We appreciate so much your time and your interest and engagement and working with us and helping us be better at our jobs. Is there anything that we haven't covered that each of you would like to share that can share our joint, improve those two joint missions that we all have?
Yeah, I'd be happy to stay on for another 15 minutes. And I know that there's a couple of outstanding questions that I wanted to get back to. I had earlier mentioned that we have about a 3 days to 1 week, 10-day turnaround. And somebody thought that was rather quick and wanted to make sure that they understood it correctly. I used to write for a newspaper, so 10 days seems like eternity to me, but that is actually, I should clarify that the medical reference articles that we assign, you get an assignment letter. We ask you to write about this, and cover this. Here's the headline. And medical reference articles do not include interviews or quotes. So they're strictly based on your research. So you're not waiting on somebody to respond to your interview request or anything like that. And typically, I think 3 to 5 days, business days, seems to be ample time for someone who has taken that assignment. But because we don't publish daily, there's always room for flexibility. And we actually make a point of telling freelancers, if you're offered an assignment and you're committed to other work, we encourage you to say no, because we don't hold that against you. We'd much rather that you turn us down than to attempt to do too much. So, and the other thing I wanted to say was, for me, since I don't deal with pitches, but I do get a lot of queries from people saying, hey, I want to write for WebMD, here are my clips. And for me personally, Monday mornings are actually the best day to reach me, because that is when my brain is freshest. And that is before the week, gets busier with meetings and other things. So Monday mornings really is, and after I've had my coffee, that's when I'm like really sharp. So.
I love, this is exactly the kind of insider information we love. So thank you for that. Shraddha, any other tips or general advice that you would want to share before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I wanted to just generally say, so we have, there were a few questions about like our career section, and like there were some people sharing their background. So I will say that we have a pretty strict conflict of interest policy, so we don't tend to let career physicians, scientists, academics write in our news pages. So we have a career section. There are like personal essays that often go up in there. It's a whole section called Working Life. And there are some but limited opportunities in the careers pages for non-journalists to publish, but in our news pages, we are pretty strict about only having journalists write for us, just given our conflict of interest policy. We have a lot of people on staff who were scientists at some point. They have PhDs, but they have switched careers to now being journalists. Like that's not what I'm talking about. But like if you're a physician currently, yes, you absolutely have a certain expertise. But if that is still what you're primarily doing, then like we probably won't accept a pitch from you. So sorry, but that's just our policy. But we have lots of people who did it for a while, and then like given enough time, like that conflict sort of goes away. So maybe you went to medical school but never actually did anything with that, and it's been a few years, then you could still write for us. So never say never, but generally those are our rules.
I think going to medical school and not practicing would be a very expensive decision.
Yes, it would be, but yeah, you never know where life takes you, I guess.
Definitely. There's another question I think was directed at WebMD. So the types of assignments that we make. So my specific team currently is not assigning a lot of new articles, because our focus for the past year and going into 2024 is really just cleaning out the inventory and optimizing them. And that project requires both freelance editors and writers. And so we're taking existing articles, sometimes merging content from a different article into that target article. And to give you an idea of the kind of topics that we cover, we're strictly consumer health. I'm looking at the project dashboard, and the story slugs, just give you a real sense of the range of topics that we tackle. So, there's things like kidney stone causes, aortic aneurysm, food for diabetics, and then there's cayenne pepper, and there's hickey, rashes. So it's just really, it runs the gamut. And this is what I said earlier about being able to parachute into something, whether you're a financial reporter or a health reporter. There's not going to be any assignment really where you go, oh, I already know everything about this. I already, or more often what you hear is somebody gets an assignment and they say, I've never heard of ankylosing spondylitis until now, right? But your job as a writer is to actually become an expert in ankylosing spondylitis and write that article for us. And then you take that hat off and you go on to the next one. And that is what I look for, the ability to really be able to digest the complex information and then write it for your, pretty adequately smart 8th grader. So.
Thank you so much. I want to thank both of you so much for being here. To me, this has been an incredibly informative and enlightening and encouraging conversation. And I've been doing this full time for 15 years. So I know I speak for everyone. We're just so grateful for your time. There was a question in the Q&A about how each of you is supporting freelancers. And I would say this webinar was definitely a huge support, your time preparing and coming and speaking with us and being so frank and warm. We really are so grateful to both of you and to Lori Leibovich for being here. I also want to thank everyone in the audience for the engagement, for the wonderful questions. We look forward to seeing you in October for our next webinar. And you can find out the topic at the IIJ.com because my brain is full. We also welcome any support. If you found this valuable, you can donate, make a tax-deductible donation at the IIJ.com. We're really thrilled to have a fiscal sponsor relationship with the Players Philanthropy Fund as of this summer. So please don't feel obligated, but we certainly would welcome it. And best of luck to everyone in your pitching and your writing letters of introduction. And I hope that Kyung and Shraddha, that you get wonderful on-point communications from folks in the audience and that we stay in touch and that this is not the last, but the first of many wonderful conversations like this. So thank you all so much for being here.
Thanks for the wonderful session, Katherine.
Yes,
Bye,
thank
everyone.
you so much for the invitation and thanks to everyone for being here.
Bye.